My grandfather told me a story about carrying a message on the Western Front in 1917. He was a small man and he was very fast, and his job was often to carry messages from post to post. But that kernel of an idea sat with me, and I was always fascinated by the war, perhaps because my grandfather told me about it when I was very young, 9, 10, 11. Perhaps because at that stage in my life, I'm not sure I'd ever even heard of a war. You know, one of the things we take for granted is we in the West, at least in England, are born in peacetime. Unless you're now in your mid-60s, 70s, you were not born during a war, and you have not known a war on this scale. So for me, it was an eye-opening. I couldn't believe that the man that I knew, this very loquacious, charming, theatrical, funny, chatty storyteller of a man, had this horrific experience as a young man. Fundamentally, it's a very simple story. Two men have about 8 hours to get from one part of the Western Front in 1917, in the middle of the First World War, to another. If they do it, they will save the lives of 1,600 men, including one of those men's brothers. If they don't, then not only will his brother die, but those other men are likely to be doomed. And in that respect, it's a ticking clock thriller. You gradually find out that George Mackay's character, Schofield, has been there a while. He has seen combat. He has seen some of the horrors of the Somme. He's perhaps a slightly different class to Blake. And there's a kind of quiet nobility to him, a sort of understated heroism, which I thought was beautifully embodied by George. To a degree, he brings that with him for free. He has that about him as a person, and that's what one is looking for. Dean feels younger. I think he is younger than George. Perhaps a different class, a little bit more street, a little less experienced, has been there for a shorter time, has not seen combat. There's a sweetness about him, a naivety. He's a naturally good-spirited joker, really, and someone who chats, a chatter, rather than someone who holds his cards close to his chest. What I wanted an audience to do was, through the micro of these two men's journeys in real time, just 2 hours of real time, observe to some degree the macro, which is the immensity of the destruction, the vastness of the land, the thousands and thousands, millions of men, the appalling conditions, the staggering amount of waste and destruction and lives lost. And yet always to stick within the footprint of this 2 hours of real time. And I felt like if you were to look, it's like looking through a tiny, tiny keyhole into an enormous panorama of horror. I don't want people thinking about the camera particularly. I want people only thinking about the emotional journey these men are taking. But it does have a compound effect, a gradual growing menace. Something is coming, something unstoppable. And combine the technique of the filmmaking with the fact that we're moving always forward, not always walking, sometimes running, sometimes in trucks, sometimes in the river, sometimes carried by forces greater than themselves. But it never goes back. All the decisions came from the relationship between the camera and the actor. And that began with me and Roger sitting in a room going, how are we going to shoot this scene? Where is he going to be standing? Do you not want to have that line on camera? Because if you have a dialogue scene, to state the obvious, what I didn't want, and neither did Roger, and we don't do at any point in the movie, is hinge the camera back and forth between two people speaking dialogue. To me, that you might as well cut. That's not what I wanted. What I wanted was one ribbon, like a snake, moving forward, in which the information that you needed happened to fall in front of where the camera was pointing. There's a sequence in the movie which I suppose is the most hallucinatory sequence of the film, in which the Germans, who are looking for British stragglers, are firing flares up into the air. and Schofield's caught in these weird flare lights, and it's almost as if he's been knocked out, woken up, and he's half in and half out of consciousness. There's something nightmarish about it and strange. And it almost feels like the ground beneath his feet is moving because the light is moving. So that proved a big challenge for us. But again, I think light being, one of the greatest ways of telling any kind of emotional story or creating any kind of atmosphere, and Roger Deakins being a master of it, helped enormously. The hilltop towns and the small towns and villages of northern France were all utterly razed to the ground during the Great War. And now when you go to visit the sites of those battles, you're very struck by how the villages and towns have all been built in the middle of the 20th century. Nothing, what I would call, period, remains. So what Dennis was doing in part was constructing a lost world, was constructing a world that had now been destroyed entirely.